really important for the immune system. So what kind of people are interested in this region? So one real important application is people getting transplants. If you know the sequence in that region, or yourself and your donor, you can predict pretty well, are you going to have any compatibility issues? That's one of the original applications. Then second application is anyone working with infectious diseases, developing vaccines. Again, it's really useful to know the sequences and their participants of these studies. And third, what was third? Oops. Third is people working with studying autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis or diabetes. Turns out it's most relevant region here too.
EPA.
EPA?
That third one? Congress. EPA?
Oh.
You got your clue?
Yeah, I'm sure it's also somehow involved here. Okay, and so this is, like I said, there's all these applications, but one of the catches is that this region here is really, really difficult to sequence because it has lots of diversity. It's one of the more trickier regions to sequence. So basically, people send us samples, which could be like spit or blood or I don't know what kind of other bodily fluids. And we'll come with a sequence. It's kind of like they send us binaries, and we're going to decompile them. So in this case here, that could be like it could be a new organism, or it could be even a new gene we're sequencing. So this whole process, it's pretty expensive. It can take like weeks or months. More typical after you have done that on quite a few times, you can kind of establish a database so you know all the existing variations. And basically, the job at that point is just to determine like which specific, like imagine you have source code and you just need to tell people, well, the binary you sent me corresponds to like it's revision 13 of the production branch. So that's basically what we do. Now here's a slightly expanded version, a more detailed version of how this workflow looks like. So typically, we get the samples, we'll transfer them onto, so the thing we work with are these 96 well plates. So the samples are transferred onto these, and we can amp those around, so something to play with.
DNA.
So people send us cells, we try to extract the DNA, there's some we quantified based on the concentration, we'll normalize them, there's amplification step, and you can see there's lots of stuff going on here. There's some QC steps where we go and look at data, and depending on the outcome we may have to go back and repeat certain work. There's, so these are lab steps here. There's some data analysis steps here. So probably our secret sauce is probably in here. Taking the output from the sequencer machines and going and processing the data, displaying it. There's some final reviewing that needs to go on here until you come with the final results. So this process here, instead of taking like weeks, this can be done like maybe within a week or so, and it may cost like probably less than $100 per sample. So this is just a peek inside of our lab.
Is it just across the street?
Yep. On the third floor, you could probably see inside. So here we're looking over at group health. They're a pretty small lab. We have like there were 2 developers, 2 bioinformatics specialists. We have 3 people in the lab, and 1 person who gets the money. You can see here these big machines here are sequencer machines. These funny calculators here are kind of like photocopying machines for DNA.
Which one was I supposed to spit in?
Here you can see that's kind of a workplace for one of the lab technicians. So they'll have these pipettes to transfer samples between plates or from tubes to plates. So that was just a bit of background. Now here I'll quickly show you a couple of screenshots. So we have this application that basically tries to manage all the different steps in this workflow. So this is kind of a dashboard perspective where they can see like, okay, like what work is queued up. You can see like different tasks that are outstanding have been completed. They can manage incoming samples, and they can go and say, okay, this is the work that needs to be done. So here I have an example of a workflow. It's a bit simpler than the one we saw in the slide before. And one of the things the application does, it provides support for the individual tasks in these workflows. So here's a pretty important task which helps transfer samples onto plates. So it's not necessarily straightforward because we can have within one plate we can get samples from. We have a mixture of samples from different projects, different workflows. So there's some algorithms to try to sort of optimize the layout, and then even with all the algorithms, they may still decide to manually go and override everything and to do things different anyway. So that's an example of a task. Here we have an example of a QC, quality control task. You see individual samples, and they'll have some quality scores, and they'll look at this data, and they may go and flag individual samples, say, okay, here we need to repeat the last step, or we need to go back and repeat the last 2 steps. This is another example of some QC metrics I need to look at. Here, this is the interface where they review the final results. These colorful lines act are the output from the sequencing machines. So the goal here is kind of to detect, okay, what's the correct code at any given position. And this here isn't really a part of the interface that we use, but it shows, so there's, when we go through this workflow, basically we end up with a whole sample graph. So if later on there's any issue anywhere with one of the results, you can always go and track back and see like, okay, what other, if there was an issue earlier on the workflow, what other samples are potentially implicated.
Here.
Yep.
What is the yellow box there indicate in the UI?
Oh, that's just because that's the current selection.
Okay.
So you select the sample here, and we'll open up the whole sample graph in which this sample appears. And, you can see it in context.
I could ask some questions in some detail, but I don't want to derail if you want to go through.
Oh, no, go ahead. I don't have that many slides, so
okay.
We don't start some arguments.
But they're also a little technical because I've done some development of Eclipse plugins, so if it goes too deep, then let me know so that I don't derail again.
Yes.
So like one of the things that I was curious about is in Eclipse there's the idea of a view versus an editor. And I was just wondering how you did that here, where you don't have like one central pane, it's like the main pane with like views around it. the way that the editor pane works. So I was just kind of curious, is there like a main like window here, or that
Yeah,
thing is clustered around, or?
Yeah, so you have it in, I guess we'll get to it later too, so in anyone who does work with Eclipse, you're familiar, you have different perspectives. And so in this particular perspective, it's a bit special. You only have views. There's no editors.
Okay.
So if you have an editor, there's usually some editing life cycle associated with it, right?
Right.
So you open up something, you can do some changes. You may save, or you may just close it without saving. Here, this is more kind of a dashboard-like thing.
And that was another one of my questions, whether you were using perspectives, because this collection of views looks very different than a different collection of views.
Exactly. So here, if you look at this perspective that's associated with a specific task, so you can see this here.
Yeah,
So
it did look like an editor.
this is actually an editor.
Because it's a dirty editor with the star.
Exactly, and there are two views. So with views, they don't have their own life cycle, so they're kind of basically, let's say you have a view that lists all your projects in the system. If you go and delete something there, it's going to take effect immediately. Or they're kind of attached to an editor, which is the case here. So you could go, if you change anything here, it's going to mark the editor dirty. If you switch between different, you have multiple editors open, you switch between them, you're going to get different stuff showing up here.
Do you use Bird for your graphic?
Yeah. It was the.
So Bird's a sub-project of Eclipse.
So that's just for drawing charts. We also have like a chart or report designer and stuff, but we just use the chart API. And the graphing stuff, there's a library called Zest, which is also part of Eclipse. Okay, so let's.
One more. Do you use EMF
Yeah.
behind the scenes here?
Nope. No. Oh, we use GEF. But it's the graphical editing framework, kind of an abstraction where you can have sort of instead of focusing too much on let's see, look at this example here, like the this plate here. So instead of like focusing too much on drawing circles and stuff, you have like different. You have like a well object, and there's a container object, and you have like a layout manager, and you can book in actions and stuff. So that's pretty neat. So you can develop at a pretty high level of abstraction, which means less code, but more times reading API docs and then figuring out how stuff works. So before we go back into more details on Eclipse RCP, I'd like to get started a bit more on the rationale for using OSGi. So in our case, actually we built like 3 versions of the application. There's like a standalone version, which is useful for testing, or like our boss may have it on his laptop when he goes to some conference to show it off, or and we have like a client and a server version. And so there's like different parts of the application, depending on, like in the standalone version, has like a H2 database, whereas the client and server, they use Postgres. There's obviously there's a UI parts. They're only present in the standalone, the client version. We have something that goes and runs background jobs. That's present in the standalone, the server version, etc. And so basically, the problem is when you're building these 3 products, how do you make sure you end up with like 3 zip files or whatever that have all the proper libraries? So you need some notion of some kind of module system. Now, just to get that done, you could just have a module system that's purely a build time affair. So I don't know, does anyone do anything non-OSGi-like to kind of figure out which jars to bundle up in their application?
Maven.
Yeah, exactly. Maven would. So now, in addition to the kind of core parts of the application, there are all these different workflows. So some of them are pretty similar, and others are a bit different, but may still share some parts. So like here we have one workflow, and we have a second workflow that's almost identical, but like it uses a slightly different version of one of the steps in the workflow. So this issue, how do you deal with that? Especially, that's kind of a tricky case if you have like two versions that need to coexist in the same installation. So that's kind of a problem OSGi is meant to address. So I'll start just getting into some details. So basically, if you have a OSGi, so an OSGi bundle is basically a module, and it's nothing much. It's a jar file like any other library. That if you look in the manifest file, there's a couple of extra entries. So we have a whole bunch here. The only ones that are really required, I guess, you need to give a name and a kind of a symbolic name, and you need to give a version. So if you take your whatever jars you have, you go at those headers, you can say, hey, I'm using OSGi. But so another important thing is that you can, if you want other OSGi bundles to go and use classes from your library, what you do is you add package exports. So you can say, okay, I have these two packages, and they should be available to other packages. And so this means that by default, any other package, if there's like an internal package or whatever, other OSGi bundles won't be able to see classes in them. And so that's really useful because otherwise the only mechanism you have in Java to accomplish this kind of hiding is package private classes, right? That kind of means you have to throw all your classes into the same package in order to make sure that these, like if you have some implementation classes, you could make them package private, but then they have to live together with the interfaces or whatever. So with this mechanism, we can keep them in separate packages, but they'll still be yeah.
So within those packages, do they only have interfaces, or do they have interfaces and implementations, or?
Well, you can do and there's nothing that enforces that, like, oh, you must have a package that only has interfaces or only implementations.
I guess from a best practice, or
I guess kind of best practice, often you'll want to make interfaces available. But then again, like if you have a library, like some collections library, obviously you want people to use some your implementation classes too. So that's
Just to clarify though, it's not that they can't use other packages within that bundle, it's just that they can't directly access them, only indirectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or is it that they're not even available in the class level?
They're not available.
Right.
In OSGi, it'll actually restrict access to only the things you export explicitly.
well, they can. I mean,
So
if you're
you
using
have-
something in the
Very
demo,
hard to get to.
you're using a class in the demo bundle, and that class uses really obviously that class can use something
Yes.
in the internal package.
Well,
you start-
that's the question here. I'm just kind of extrapolating from his, that if you have the interface in an exposed package, but you have the impl in a non-exposed package, are you going to have a runtime failure?
Well, it still needs some kind of factory in that case, right, to get hold of the implementation of an
Right.
instance of the implementation, right?
Right. However you were to get it, in any case, you wouldn't fail to run because the impl was in a non-exposed package. You just need some way to get a handle on a real impl.
Yeah.
The code within the bundle can link to internal details. You cannot import
Right.
anything that you can't see.
So you have the export, and correspondingly we have imports, where we're going looking for packages in other OSGi bundles. One thing that may strike some people as odd is that even though we have a version number at the bundle level, the packages, they're also versioned. So we could be exporting like version 1 of the demo bundle, but the version 2 of UI bundle. So it's some extra flexibility that's there. I don't know if it's terribly useful. Another thing worth pointing out is that when you're importing, you don't necessarily need to put exact version constraints. You can say like what's happening here. We say we want to have at least version 10.0.0, but anything else that's as long as it's less than 11.0.0 is okay too. So let's see this. Another thing worth pointing out, so we can add stuff. We can have like normal, if you have a common thing, if you're doing OSGi development and you're using some library and it doesn't come with OSGi headers and you're just using it in one small place, you're often tempted, you can just nest it inside the bundle and throw it on the bundle's internal class path. Or you can put it directly with resource files, whatever. Also, optionally, you can specify like a version of Java this bundle is meant to run on. So if someone tries to deploy it to the wrong version, getting some kind of error when you try to run it because some Java line class whatever is not found, it will fail immediately. Another thing we'll look at is this thing called bundle activator. That's kind of like a main class in OSGi. We'll have an example later.
Eric, I got a question.
Yep.
Is OSGi just using Java, or is it using other languages?
I think it's very specific to Java, because if you look at the specifications, they're all kind of everything is defined in terms of Java interfaces, and I'm not aware of any other non-Java implementations. So that's kind of the normal class loader hierarchy. Let's say you're in Tomcat or whatever. You have a hierarchical class loading system, or you have or even a plain Java application. You have a bootstrap class loader at the top, which loads the Java lang stuff from the RT-jar. You have an extension class loader, which picks up anything in the what's the directory text.
Endorsed lives.
Yeah, the endorsed whatever. You'll have the actual class path of the application. And so if you're loading a class here, it's always going to try to get from the top level, if not goes down. And now one of the issues with this setup is, let's say we have we have like 3 different web apps, and we have some utility library, whatever. We're either going to have to like copy it and have it be part of each of the web applications, or we're going to have to like push it up and drop it in the container. I don't know if anyone ever had any ran into any problems because of that. Or because like your application server decided this is a very common library, we'll just put it in there by default, ought to be useful for anyone. And then in your application you want to use like a newer version, and bad things happen. So with OSGi, basically there's still the basic class loading thing is left intact, but in the OSGi container, basically the class loaders are hierarchical. So basically, any bundle can load classes from any other bundle. So let's say bundle 4 maybe some utility library, and you could have another bundle 5 that's the same utility library but a different version. And everyone can load classes from anyone else. So one thing I was pointing out.
Subject to the import-export rules.
Through the import-export, exactly. Yeah, that's a precondition. But it's definitely more flexible and we have the two options. Yeah.
Do you ever have any issues with regards to like circular dependencies, that you can have accidentally between bundles?
Yeah, you can do circular dependencies. It's possible. If it's you probably want to avoid them just because it's confusing.
But to do that, is it resolvable easily, or how?
Yeah, it can still resolve.
I mean, is that something us developers have to be aware of and know, kind of the dependency graph is to avoid having any circular dependencies, or does the system have anything that you're aware of that where it detects it or handles it somehow, or?
Eclipse will detect cycles.
Yeah, and also remember, at one point we had a cyclic dependence, and there was some issue with one of the Apache Build tools that, like by default, it would blow up, and you had to set this special option to allow it. I don't know if that's still the case, but so in principle you can have cyclic dependencies, but it's probably not a good idea. Oh yeah, so I wanted to point out. So basically, up to now, what I was saying is that you have like one bundle, one class loader, and you have all this delegation. There is a special case. You can basically take a bundle and insert it into the class loading space of another bundle. So in that case, you call it, say, it's a fragment bundle, and it has a host bundle. So there are a couple of cases where this is really useful. One of them is unit testing. So in unit testing, often what we do is you have like a parallel package structure, right? And also, first of all, you may want to have unit tests for like some internal package. So it's neat if you don't need to like export that internal package, just so you can import it in the other package and for doing your tests. But the other thing is also is that often you'll like in your unit tests, because you have to say this parallel package structure, and then you use like a package private access to go and do stuff with your objects that are being tested. Now the issue there is that the package private access does not work if you have two different class loaders. So basically, both classes, you have two classes, even if they're the same package, if they don't have the same class loader, it's not going to work. So that's one reason why unit tests are put in fragments. Also, it's convenient to you could also just say, well, let's put them in the main bundle, but then there's the whole issue that you don't want to deploy your unit tests. Another use for fragment bundles is localization. You could put like resource files that are going to get read by the bundle.
Can you use that for like environment configuration? So you could have, using the fragment or whatever, you can object that this is for this environment versus that environment. Using the
Yeah,
class
you can in a bundle, you can say this bundle is specifically for like Windows 64-bit, and will only load on that platform. And so you can have like, I'll show an example later. You can see that. So when you're working with Eclipse RCP, it uses SWT, which is a platform-specific library. And so you'll see that there's basically a platform-specific fragment attached to the generic SWT bundle. And yeah, speaking of configuration, one thing we use a fragment for is to configure logging. So imagine you have some logging framework, it's in a bundle, and so you have like some, you have a configuration file, and maybe in that configuration file you mentioned some custom logging, whatever, logger, appender, whatever. And so the problem, of course, is that the logging bundle even if it's using OSGi, it obviously doesn't have like an import your custom package with your custom logger. So it wouldn't be able to instantiate the custom logger or appender. But by basically providing this as a fragment, you can attach the fragment to the logging bundle, and everything works. So there's a whole bunch of OSGi implementations. So the three main ones really are Equinox, which is the OSGi implementation that's used in the Eclipse ID or Eclipse RCP. But you can also, it's possible you can just run it alone. There is Apache Felix, which has lots of tools and stuff around it. And there's a third one with some unpronounceable name. Then there's a bunch of kind of containers that build on top, like there's Eclipse Virgo, which adds some management features and web application support and whatnot on top of Equinox. There's the Glassfish and there's this one. JBoss. JBoss, exactly. So Glassfish, I know, embeds Apache Felix, and so these are Glassfish and JBoss are full JDE application servers. So Glassfish embeds Felix. I don't know, I'm not sure what JBoss does. I think they may actually have their own implementation. But so apparently both of these support OSGi bundles, so you can, in addition to deploying like an ordinary WAR file, you could deploy a OSGi WAR file. So let's see, we could quickly do a quick demo. Yeah.
You know, I was going to add to that list, what is it, Spring DM server? But then someone was telling me that that actually has evolved into Virgo. Does anyone know about that?
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. They donated it to the Eclipse Foundation and it's evolved to Virgo.
Okay, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
donated.
Oh, so there's no more Spring DM server, it's just that?
Yeah, that's the exact same.
The
Yes.
The big things that have happened over the last few years is they came out with the enterprise specs that basically OSGified the entire J2EE space so that it would work on in this class level environment. So AS7, Glassfish, and Virgo all have implementations of the enterprise specifications, which are kind of neat.
And by the way, interesting, I was mentioning that I didn't know what Apache Carafe was, so I just quick looked it up, and it is a small OSGi-based runtime which provides a lightweight container onto which various components and applications can be deployed. And it says it works with Equinox and Felix. There you go.
So it's kind of, I guess it's also something that's built on top.
And Upperfish became Felix, I believe.
No, they're
I
different.
think it's still.
They used to be.
Yeah,
I haven't heard
it's,
that they've merged.
it's confusing. So I'll just say the only one that we have really worked with is Equinox.
The good news is there's quite a bit of activity in Spring.
Yeah. What's strange, I'm not sure what's going on with Spring Source. For a while they seemed very enthusiastic about OSGi, so they started all those projects and they seem to kind of have moved on. So
I asked the same question to the Spring one last week.
yeah, you got any useful response?
I think they're still very interested in it. They just thought it was too far ahead where they were. So
Yeah, I guess imagine they would have like a big flood of consulting work coming in, but
the CTO still believes in modularity.
APIs, you start coding your own domains to do your own thing with domains.
Did you look at, did you have any need to render an HTML? Did you look at Graphical?
Eclipse has the same notion.
no, so that's basically the idea, I guess, so you can create the RCP application and like almost the same code should work like as a web application. So I figured, I haven't looked into that.
I didn't try writing any code in it, but I looked in the graph a couple years ago. It's a different API. It looks very much like the same API that you use to write an RCP app, but it's like an adapter around it, and then you can then render it as either an RCP app or a web app. And it seemed like by doing that, you only get whatever the adapter supports, and you give up like the full control of an RCP app. So if you really have a need to run it either as a rich app or as a web app, and flip between them, that seemed to be the only market where that really made sense. Unfortunately, to convert an RCP app to a wrap app looked like kind of circular work.
Okay, and then you have sort of a common denominator approach.
Yeah, exactly. Because it sort of shadows the RCP API, like JFace.
Yeah, yeah. So that's another thing we'll probably get into the discussions, you know, like so with RCP, because it is a desktop thing that needs to be installed. So it's obviously there is a bit more work than rolling it out with a plain web application. Then again, there's some automatic update mechanisms and stuff to kind of mitigate that. So I just quickly thought we could do a quick run through, quickly see if we're like in Eclipse. We developed sort of a very simple OSGi module. So I don't know about the support in NetBeans and IntelliJ. I think they have some support for OSGi modules. So just go and create a simple plugin project to give it some name. Nothing too exciting.
Real quick, and this may or may not be the right time to ask, do you use Tycho to build?
Yeah, I'll get to that. Yeah, so right now we're kind of just doing everything when, you know, clicking around in the IDE. Now, in practice, that's probably not how you want to build your software and deploy things. So, okay, so basically, of course, Eclipse has all these fancy wizards and forms. But we can see basically so it generates this manifest for us. So it's interesting. Let's see. There's this. Let's go. There's this Activator class. So like I mentioned before, this is basically like a main class. So we can add some code that gets executed when the bundle is started and when it's stopped. Okay, it's terribly exciting. It's okay. Now to launch Equinox, we'll need to go and create a new launch configuration, which we neatly made right here. Okay, so right now currently we only have a single bundle in our system. So looks like we do at the very minimum, we need to include the OSGi framework bundle. Okay, here we go. Yeah. I hear that button sometimes, you do it and it'll like
Explodes it. Especially if it's an optional code.
Hello. I expect to press downstairs, he can get in.
Cool. Someone needs to. Okay, so I can start this, and so something happen. We get this OSGi console. So we have some bunch of commands, like there's a command we can go and look at what bundles are available. Let's see, there's an active bundle, let's see framework, and there's a bundle that appears as resolved. So now what we can do, we can start this bundle, and behold, it's the bundle activator is run. We can stop it again. We could go and start it again and rinse and repeat however many times you like. Okay, there we go. Now I guess it's not too much fun having using OSGi. We have a single bundle. So let's go and maybe import a third-party library. So let's see. So earlier I downloaded. So does anyone use Guava? So they could happen to distribute a version comes with OSGi metadata.
You said they do?
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So when we started this like years ago, like we used lots of third-party libraries, and it was a bit of an issue that none of them had OSGi versions. So you either have to go and modify them and add headers yourself, or go through some third party that provided like bundled up versions. Like meanwhile, almost most popular libraries have OSGi versions.
Are they accurate? Because it's a lot touchier than even like having Maven dependencies for a POM in the central
Well,
repo.
I'll get to that later. So one reason why lots of projects provide OSGi is that if you're using Maven, it's really easy to have Maven automatically like insert the extra OSGi headers.
So you're wrapping it, right? Is that what you're doing here? Is you're creating?
No, so this one here probably has all the OSGi headers. So I'm just trying to figure out how to get it in here without. So there's different ways to deal with third-party libraries. The proper way in Eclipse is that you create the so-called target platform, and then you can directly point it at like at external repositories that contain those libraries. But now here for a quick demo, it's simple to just go and import the jar file. Version 10. There's a different way to import projects. Yeah, maybe let's get back to that later.
Did you want to import? You were in the new context menu. There's an import down below. You're in new.
So let's see, import plugins. Oh yeah, that's it. Thank you. Interestingly, it only lists the Euro version. That's okay. Okay, there we go. So it's in here. So now we could go ahead and reference to something in here that uses the library. Anyone have a favorite class in Guava?
Declare dependency first, though. Check.
Yeah, I was going to say you need it.
Yep,
That's
there you
good,
go.
because it shows you.
Exactly.
So class path.
So we want to use the ranges class, but you know, we can't just, so I have to go back to the manifest, so we could either go and edit the manifest here, or since you're in Eclipse, you can go and use the neat form interface. And so let's see, this is probably in the base package. So, but this here means basically it's going to require like version 10 of the package, and it will be happy with any newer version. So I might be a bit more strict and say I'll be happy with any version 10 dot anything, not 11. Okay, let's see if we have more left now. Remember in which package maybe it's in the collection.
There's an offer to show you how to use the automated dependency.
Yeah.
If you include that whole bundle, then you can just code it and it'll automatically do the import for you. Yes, I'm good.
There we go. So, just that wrong package. Okay, we can do whatever. Okay, now we go back and let's see, try to start this up again. So let's see if this included it automatically. Okay, let's first see what happens if we don't have this library included. So it's interesting to see the our demo bundle. It's no longer resolved. It's only installed. So I'll get back to that. There's different transitions and life cycle events. So let's go ahead and add this package. Okay, you can see they're both resolved. Okay, now we can go ahead and start our demo bundle. And something happens. Okay, I think we'll get on with the slides. Okay, here's a slightly, that's the same kind of console with a slightly more complicated application. So we can see we have a bundle here that's active. You can see there's resolved bundles. This here is interesting. It's marked as lazy. That means basically there's an option you can have bundles be started automatically the first time someone uses a class from that bundle. Yep.
Is that just a config in the manifest or something like that, or do you know how that's included?
So whether or not so there's the issue should a bundle be started or not?
Right.
So that's not in the manifest. So that's kind of a deployment thing. Like if you look at tutorials, you like I did now, you go and you say, start this bundle, stop it, whatever. Yeah, you can, but that's not the OSGi standard thing. There's ways like in Eclipse you can create like a p2.py file where you specify, well, this bundle, when it's installed, it has to be automatically started.
So is it container specific when we make it later?
Yeah. Yeah, so here that's the, you can see different states a bundle can be in. So once installed just means the container is aware that this bundle exists. If the bundle exists, then basically all the package imports can be resolved. It will automatically transition to resolved. And so if you're just talking about some utility library or something, that's basically, that's all we ever need. Now if the bundle has one of those activator classes, if we want to be kicked off, basically we have to make sure it gets started, and it will transition to active, it can be stopped again, and this can be repeated as many times as you'll have.
So if it's installed, does it mean it's invalid? Because it wouldn't always be resolved. Like, would it?
Yeah, that's usually it should, like maybe it's just a few milliseconds it will be installed, it should transition to resolved.
For a bundle to be resolved, its dependencies must be also resolved, right?
Yeah.
So if it can't resolve any of its
Yeah, so that's a kind
constraints,
of a transitive thing,
right.
exactly.
yeah, it's not really fair for me.
Yeah, and what's interesting, even once something is resolved, you can go in and remove an existing bundle, and it can get unresolved and revert back to installed. So that's not something that just the whole dynamic nature of OSGi, which for some people is pretty interesting. I have to say we don't make much use of it. That you could go and add stuff and remove stuff and replace stuff without having to ever shut down your virtual machine. So that could be useful for some people. So now so far we've just talked about so you can export packages, but OSGi also has a mechanism where you can basically share objects. You can export an instance. So this is kind of the low-level way to do it. So in your Activator, you get this bundle context, and you can basically you can call this register service method. You give it the class or interface name and the instance to go and consume a service. You call this get service reference method, and you get the reference from which you can actually get the service. So that's basically how it works. In practice, this is kind of ugly, so there's more convenient ways. So for example, if you're using Spring, there's this Spring DM extension, so if your normal Spring context, and there's so Spring DM adds some extra features, so you can like reference a service, which you can then use like a normal bean, or you can export services. So just very basic thing. There's more fancy stuff you can do, like you can get the list of all services that implement a certain interface, and you can put additional constraints and do some matching, and only get services that were exported with a certain key value pairs and whatnot.
Yep. Are you going to talk about the Spring and OSGi integration a little more detail later on? Because I have some questions about that.
Yeah, so now is the time.
Okay. So what exactly does this do? I mean, does this, this is a config file that runs within one of the OSGi implementations, or is there like a separate Spring OSGi integration?
Oh, so this is a kind of a normal Spring context.
Right.
You could do other, and so this file would live, typically you would put it in the meta of Spring context XML. And so so the issue is like so who creates your Spring context? So like if you're doing a web application, you have like a context, what's it called? The
Application context.
some kind of you can register some kind of a listener, so when the WAR is deployed, it will automatically. And now for OSGi Implement, there's a more interesting approach. So basically, Spring gives you a bundle that you install, and this bundle will basically listen. It registers with the OSGi framework, and it listens for any new bundle that is started. So as soon as, let's say, we have a foo bundle, as soon as this bundle is started, it the Spring bundle is going to get the notification. It's going to look inside this bundle. It's going to see, oh, there's a Spring context file, and it's going to go and process this file.
So this bundle wouldn't have an activator. But
So
because
exactly, it doesn't need an
because the
activator.
Spring bundle has the activator that
Yeah.
registers for the listener.
Yeah,
and then
but it does need to be started. The Spring, basically Spring bundle will only look at bundles that have been started.
So how do you get from resolve to started?
Well, let's say like you go in the console, you type start.
Well, but you
Or-
wouldn't do that normally.
There's
but-
always start bundle sequence, so the runtime configuration can say, to start this bundle when the system starts up. So
Yeah, so there's different, like I mentioned, if you're deploying stuff on Equinox, you can, with every bundle, you can include an additional file that specifies like this bundle needs to be started automatically.
So, but does this include, does Spring OSGi ship with some kind of server, meaning the OSGi server? Like,
But
can I have
that's kind of two, it's two separate projects.
Okay.
So they do have this OSGi server project, which is built on top of Equinox, and that's some extra fancier console and web support and whatnot.
it's Virgo.
It's they now called Virgo, yeah. And there's this Spring DM thing, which is just basically allows you to import, gives you a more convenient way to import and export services directly within your Spring context, and actually have even if you're not exporting and importing services, just to have your Spring context initialized.
But this will not let me have two different, this doesn't have its own class loader. I'm still depending, like if it's in a war, like in the Tomcat, let's say, it's still gonna just use this context class loader. I can't have two different jars, two different versions, using just the Spring DM. Do you know what
Well,
I'm saying?
so the service you could have like, yeah, there's one thing that's kind of interesting with the services. They're not versions. So if there's like two versions of let's say of some bundle, and they both export like a foo class,
Right.
you'd be able to get hold of both of them. So you could actually, you could have like a collection of foods, and they're like different versions. So that works.
Depending on the constraints, because you can actually constrain that to say only allow one of these to exist. Very
Exactly. So
very
and
flexible.
if you wanted to, you could put like a custom, like a version attribute when you export your service, and you can do some matching on that if you wanted to.
But were you asking about a war?
Yes, I'm talking, because from what I understand, that this can run just in the web, it doesn't have to be in the vehicle.
But I think normally wars aren't really compatible with OSGi. They kind of are. They can be used in the same space in the sense that you can have multiple wars running in a Tomcat container, for instance. In the same way, you can have multiple bundles running in an Equinox container or in an OSGi container.
Yeah, I misspoke.
So like
That's
Virgo.
not true anymore in Virgo.
So Virgo
I-
is actually
Right.
I think they call them VABs, like war
Yeah.
bundles. Or I haven't actually used any of this, but I guess the idea is you take your war and you can kick out all your web-in flip directory, and you put in some extra OSGi headers. I think the one important header, you need to put a web context path header, and in theory it should work.
And that makes sense. So I'm trying to get over the hurdle where folks who aren't familiar with the fact that it's like having, since every bundle has its own class loader, then you can start and stop jars within your JVM, and that's the thing that a lot of people aren't familiar with when they first come to OSGi.
Yeah, most folks are used to a servlet container being kind of the runtime.
Right.
OSGi is actually a service that provides HTTP, so it becomes the bottom layer, and in a sense, the whole notion of serving HTTP becomes subservient to the other things you can do under OSGi.
Yeah.
And
So this
Virgo is worth a look. Virgo is worth a look because it does let you just use plain old wars now.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, so you mentioned there's a kind of a standard HTTP service in OSGi, which has kind of a very bare bones support. So you could like just have like a simple servlet, and that would work. But then if you want to have like a web XML, you want to have your web XML read, and you have some custom JSP tags and whatnot. That will require the more advanced support that you'll find like in Virgo.
Well, since Jetty is now Eclipse Jetty, so I imagine it has all the OSGi header.
Yeah, so actually, like if you're on Eclipse RCP, there's a built-in help system, and that's running a Jetty web server. So yet another.
That was actually what I was just going to mention, is that Jain also does a bundle.
Yeah, exactly. So that's convenience. Any more questions specifically about Spring?
Well, I was just going to ask if you were using it. Were you providing this just as an example, or are you using it to wire your application together?
Yeah, we do use it.
And do you find that, like, what is it that Spring is providing you that, why are you using it in this case? Not that I'm arguing against it, because I'm generally a fan, but.
Yeah, well, we just use it generally as a dependence injection framework. So, I mean, that's the basic thing, you know. And the other thing is just to have a more neater way of importing and exporting services than having to use the Activator and go.
One thing that Spring does provide, I think, is an advantage, and it's true in Virgo, is when you get a handle on a reference to a dynamic service that may come and go, typically you have to write work with server trackers, a lot of things that deal with the dynamics, and Spring does provide a lot of proxy insulating from the dependencies coming and going. So
so that's a good point. So even though we don't care about our applications, it's really meant to that you go and add and remove stuff while running, but there's still the issue with startup. So with the normal, if you're going and looking at services, I said otherwise like package imports, you don't care too much, you can figure out things, but with service imports, if you have a bundle starting and it tries to go look up a service and the service isn't there, then it's going to blow up. So whereas if you have Spring generating these proxies, it's you don't need to be too worried about startup order. Yeah.
And which OSGi runtimes will the Spring configuration like this work with?
It should work with any. So
Should.
I'm just running the Equinox, but it doesn't use anything. It doesn't use any really weird features. It's just a normal bundle, and it uses the OSGi standard notification mechanism. So, yeah.
So Spring is a container, right? I mean, it's managing the life cycle of all the beans and interfaces and classes and what have you that you have configured within the Spring configuration. How does that fit into the OSGi, bundle, class loader, and all that stuff that it's got? I mean, is it that Spring's got its own class loader that's running within the bundle context?
I don't think Spring doesn't need class. So it does manage, it creates the objects for you and it does the injection and everything, but it will happily use the class loader you have in your bundle.
I don't think Spring is a container in the same way either, right? Like if you have a Spring web app, to what degree is Spring the container versus
That's
his
true.
web servers?
Yeah, it's still working with it.
Yeah, it's a different kind of container.
Spring is supposed to
I
install
would say
your
the other way
runtime.
around, your OSGi container is your fundamental container. Within it, you can run a Spring module or bundle, which will recognize Spring things, but most containers are going to have some kind of XML system to configure all the dependencies, because that's really the bottom level use of that file. And then you can do the things you said, like create services and listeners that resolve things dynamically.
We jokingly refer to this as dependency injection with rigor.
Yeah. So maybe one thing worth mentioning. So if you don't like Spring, that's also if you're using Google Juice, they have all the same thing. I think it's called Pde. So it's the kind of equivalent thing. It will probably work similar. It does the same thing.
You should mention just the OSGi declarative services too. If you're not internally using lots of IOC and you just want to share services, the service interface.
Yeah, that's another option. It's another XML format. And there's also, so they had this declarative services thing, and then Spring came out with their thing, which is much nicer, and everyone wanted to use that. And so there's yet another standard called Blueprint, which is kind of basically Spring is kind of like a reference implementation, but it still has slightly different syntax. So
that's Gemini now at Virgo, so it brings the notion of application right? As a set of bundles and services. In OSGi, there really isn't a pre-blueprint, there wasn't a concept of a thing you call an application. An application is just a bunch of bundles collaborating to some extent, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was looking into converting basically using the blueprints namespace instead of using the old Spring VM, but then there was something they left out, like as always with the standards, they left out like one really important feature, so I couldn't convert. Yeah.
You said blueprint. Does that run under the Eclipse? You're running under Eclipse Virgo or just Eclipse environment? And you're saying it supports blueprint in Eclipse?
Well, I mean, so the blueprint stuff, again, it could run on any OSGi container. It's not really. So it's an Eclipse project now. But
doesn't it require like 4.3 on the enterprise spec stuff?
Yeah, I don't know, like,
yeah.
I guess it's, yeah, the specific, so there's also, it's a OSGi standard specification, so I guess it should run on any, be supported by any for whatever compliance.
The enterprise specs are new, they only came out in the last like 3 years or so. And I think some of these things require the newer support from whatever OSGi runs on your Can't say I know all this myself.
So are there any more questions for Spring or the general notion that you can, you have OSGi bundles, you can import, export packages, but you can also import, export instances.
Just to clarify terminology then, so Spring DM is this mechanism for working in any OSGi container to do wiring up between services.
Oh, it's primary. It's also just to. I mean, so that's the Spring extender part, which is just to even if you weren't importing, exporting services, you want to have your Spring context initialized, and there's the Spring DM part, which is basically just it's an additional namespace in your Spring Beans configuration, which allows you to reference services and export services. So I briefly mentioned that, like, if you're using lots of third-party dependencies, you're probably not going to go and import them all into your IDE. So in Eclipse and in Equinox, I guess, there's this notion of target platforms. So in your target platform, you basically register all the third-party libraries you use. And so the way this works, I guess it's a bit small. So you can point, there's this, I guess you're all familiar with Maven repositories. And so that's something kind of similar. It's called P2. You can add P2 repositories, and within P2 repositories you have certain sets of bundles, which are called features. So you can reference specific versions of certain features. So like here, actually, instead of downloading the Guava library, I can directly say we have that's the Guava P2 repository, and I want this version 10 in my target platform. So later I'll also show how this can be used during an automated build. Kind of useful. So that's just a quick thing on the side. If you're building any kind of library and you're not using OSGi, but people are using your library, maybe using OSGi, it's, as you can see, it's completely trivial to have your library include proper manifest headers. Okay, I guess in this case not completely trivial, but basically there's this Maven bundle plugin you can include in your build. And I took a real example here, that's, I guess, Google Juice. But in practice, most of the values, the tool can choose default, will figure out reasonable values. So Maven, it knows what your project name, it knows what version, it knows all your dependencies, so it can kind of fill those in. Or you can customize things a bit, like if there's only, if you have like an internal package you want to hide, you can say, well, export everything except anything that has internal in its name. You may want to override certain automatic imports. This one is interesting. So what they're doing here is so by default it would say, like, if it knows there's a dependency on some library version 10, it would say, okay, we need version 10 or anything greater. But you can override, so this will basically make it say, like, okay, we want version 10, but up to 11, not including 11. So that's just to show if you're building a library that's worth doing. I've hassled lots of projects to go and include this kind of thing. I didn't have to do it myself. This is worth mentioning. I don't know if anyone has been following. There's some lots of talk about including some notion of modularity in Java itself. And of course, you don't want to use OSGi. They want to. It's like with Log4j, they wouldn't use the established standard. They want to do something new altogether. So I haven't looked too much into this. It's anyone familiar with this?
Tracking that conversation, never even getting into it.
Yeah, can you summarize? I tried to figure out, but it's really confusing because there's several JSRs, and then if you look at them, they've been like
the JSR died for a while
for 5 years or whatnot. And
I think there's possibilities for cooperation. I think they're going to try to take a do no harm approach.
Yeah, my guess is in the end they'll probably have something that's going to be different from OSGi, but they'll probably manage to agree that it's like mostly compatible with OSGi.
They're trying very hard to come to terms. They're still in a very active conversation to try to come together on it. I don't have a lot of hope at this stage.
Yeah.
So as long as they don't do any harm, I'll be cool with it.
Well, that's just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, could be a problem.
Okay, now let's get a bit more into Eclipse RCP. So I guess most of you are familiar with Eclipse, the IDE. And I guess some of you may have heard that you can use use Eclipse to kind of just build your own application. So before we go into too much detail, one thing worth looking at is when you do Eclipse development, you're going to it's not based on Swing. It uses something called SWT and JFace. So here's an example of creating a simple table using SWT. So this is a fairly low-level API. It kind of, I guess the idea is it kind of maps fairly straightforward, fairly directly to widgets provided by the operating system. The API is it's probably not as nice as Swing. You have something that's like integer constants and bit masks and stuff, but it's works well enough. So the previous example was using SWT, so there's this layer of abstraction on top, which is called JFace, which instead of like creating individual table rows, you'll just create like a table viewer and set like a content provider, and it will go and fetch stuff, and you can tell it how to create labels for the things it has to display. So it's kind of a one level higher. Then here's this example shows you have this notion of views. So like I can have this table viewer can appear inside the view. So let's see, I got some screenshots earlier. So we have individual views here. So in order to add a view to Eclipse, basically that's kind of the code you would implement, like a create part control method, And so that's the Java code part, but then there's also, so Eclipse has kind of a plugin extension registry. So if you want to, basically, if you do an Eclipse RCP application, you kind of start out with sort of a blank slate kind of thing. And then there's this registry and to add views and editors and menu items or whatever. You need to go and you define some pieces of XML. So in your OSGi bundle, you have an additional XML file called plugin XML. And in that file, you can list extensions you're doing. So like this is a very simple one. So your extension point is this is a predefined extension file called Eclipse UI views. And we have this view, we need to give it an ID, a name, and that's the implementation. So here's a more complicated example where we basically want to have some kind of button appear somewhere. So first we define a custom command, which is like open item. Then we define a handler that will get executed when someone wants to invoke that command. The menus extension here describes where this command is going to appear. So we want to have it show up in the toolbar of the view which is defined. And there's all kind of funny XML constraints. So you can say like under what there's a whole little language like under what conditions should this handler be active? When should it even appear? It's great fun to debug. So in practice, of course, you don't edit those files directly like so. There's a neat little editor where you can go and point and click and use wizards and stuff. If you were looking really closely, there's an interesting thing you can see here. The class, so here I'm contributing some kind of wizard, but the class here is not pointing to the actual implementation. It points to something called Spring Extension Factory. So that's yet another Spring add-on that will go and look up the implementation in your Spring context. So that lets you do dependency injection or whatever into your views and editors.
Quick question.
Yep.
When I last did Eclipse plugin stuff, the extension capability was not part of core OSGi, it was part of Eclipse. But I think there might have been talk of trying to donate it, make it part of the spec. Is it still separate? Is it still an Eclipse specific thing?
Yes, I mean, sometimes I'm also, because I'm just using this whole stack, so it gets a bit confusing, like you're never quite sure where exactly is the boundary between like what's standard, what's not standard.
Right. And
so the extension registry is definitely not standard OSGi. It is part of Equinox, so you don't need to have the whole Eclipse workbench stuff to use it. But typical people who don't have a UI, they typically don't use it. But in principle, kind of like a headless Equinox server running using the extension registry.
Right. And you could, in theory, run it on Apache Felix or something, not far-fetched as well, right? I mean, I'm sure somebody, like, as an exercise, has tried to run the Eclipse IDE on Apache Felix, right? Just for jollies?
Yeah, I guess you could probably, because, again, it's all just OSGi bundle.
There's a specification to govern the container, right?
Yeah, so the extension registry, basically you could see it as kind of a plugin system that's built on top of OSGi, where you define specific extension points. You can say, well, you can add the register such and such kind of class and set these kind of properties. And so for each extension, you have like you can define a schema that defines exactly what properties you must specify, etc. So here I'm just showing off. So one of the neat things when using RCP that there's lots of stuff you kind of get for almost free. For example, one of the neat things I like to show is like a whole framework for integrating help into your application. So basically, you just have to write some HTML files. You need to give some, assign some identifiers and register them with the framework, and it will go ahead and it will index them. You have, you can provide like context-sensitive help. It actually so it indexes the help content, so it has like Lucene internally. You can search your help files. You can have like sort of tutorials and to help you help people go through certain tasks. Here's another useful thing. This is sort of a job management framework. Basically, you can create jobs. You can have them scheduled, and the platform handles all the show up some UI. You have progress dialogues. You can see if there's multiple jobs queued up. You can go and cancel jobs. So that's kind of a neat feature you get for free. And here a very useful thing is the, that's kind of a critical thing, the automatic update feature. So you can have, basically you can have you can set up your Eclipse to your RCP application to update itself. Let's say every time they restart it, it will go and you reconfigure some repository location, where you'll put all your updated code and it goes and updates. So again, it's not quite as simple as rolling out the web application, but it's not too bad.
So I envisioned that this was a tool you guys were using internally, but is this a product you're selling, or, I mean, who are your clients that are doing updates?
So currently we mainly use it internally. It's like maybe there's less than a dozen installations. So even worst case, if we had to go and manually update every single installation, it's not a complete disaster. We have like one off-site customer and like one installation. Now we were thinking about having to support like thousands of users all over. We probably wouldn't do this. In well-controlled environments, it works perfectly.
What would you do if you did have thousands of users?
Well, then it also depends on like how big is the team. If you have, so in our case, if we actually had like thousands of people and we would have so much money, it wouldn't be an issue to. But if you kind of have to support, like you have one person who has to support like thousands of deployments, and these deployments are at sites where you have like people who don't have proper IT support or anything, and they're going to have need to worry, are they going to have the proper version of Java installed, or are they going to accidentally delete stuff and whatnot? That might not be manageable.
Could you bundle JRE with that? I mean, with the down?
Yeah, you can if you don't have, but I guess you could, like for the initial installation, you could create some kind of installer, or you can even, the initial start, you can even do via Java Web Start.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't tried it, but in principle it should work.
I think it was on the roadmap a couple of years ago to have, when you built an RCP app, that you could have it include Java runtime, because it actually uses a native runner, like an exe on Windows or whatever, to kickstart, like to bootstrap. And so it would have the ability to use an internally embedded Java implementation, or JRE.
Yeah, that would be useful. Also, another thing would be having some kind of installer.
Yeah.
If you have to, like this typically, especially if like a client server setup, you at least initially you have to like enter where is your server, what's your username, etc. So
Eclipse doesn't by itself.
Eclipse itself doesn't, but I mean, Eclipse is just an RCP app. It doesn't necessarily mean all RCP apps are that.
I'd be curious if there's anybody who's got experience of managing thousands of desktops with Java applications installed.
yeah, so if you go like the Eclipse website, they'll have like case studies, kind of a long list of big organizations who are using Eclipse RCP. And I guess that would be like a place to start. You could go, and some of these organizations are really large, but you never know, maybe it's an application just like 2 people at a large organization are using. No way to tell. So this is something we briefly touched. You probably don't want to, every time you want some kind of automated build system, right? And you want to be able to run your tests automatically and everything. So Eclipse has they do have this thing called Pde Build, which is a bunch of Ant scripts and stuff that you need to copy paste around, and it kind of works until you, like, let's say, to run unit tests, and then you need to go and download a whole separate framework. So we ended up using this. There's a project it was started by a company called Sonatype, which does lots of Maven work. So they created like a Maven plugin to build Eclipse plugins. Or of course in Eclipse RCP applications or everything. So they have basically you can see here it's a standard Maven POM file, and there's a little bit of configuration for this plugin. What's interesting then, if you look at the POM file for any of the projects in a typical Maven file, a typical Maven POM for a normal project, you would have all the dependencies listed somewhere here. Say, oh, we're using the Guava library, whatever. And in this case, you can see there's none of those dependencies. It will all get them from the OSGi manifest. So that's kind of neat to not have any duplication. So here there's different packaging types. So like you can have someone will just create a normal bundle. You can also have this special packaging type to run JUnit tests. There's a special packaging type to create features, which is basically a set of bundles. Now here's another interesting topic. So I mentioned you can easily run your unit tests, and even like basic interaction with the OSGi framework you can hook up. But so you still want to do some kind of functional testing where you basically click through your UI. So there's a bunch of tools we looked at. So the first one was originally was a product called Window Tester. It was sold by a company in Portland and then got bought by Google. Now it's available for free. So this tool is quite nice in the sense that basically you can have sort of a recording function. You record tests and it will generate pretty neat JUnit tests, which you can then pretty readable. You have things like, it has like UI dot click on this button, UI dot do whatever. The only one show-stopping issue is that they can't deal with native dialogues, which is like if you're in the application, you need to go and select any files or directories. That's kind of bad luck. So that's kind of a showstopper. And that's the same problem with this other project, which is kind of weird. It doesn't have any recording. You need to kind of assemble your test, dragging and dropping different components. So I recently came across another kind of semi-commercial product called Q7. So this one also supports, you can record tests, and it does support the native dialogues. The one thing it's a bit less nice, it doesn't, it uses some kind of DSL to record the presented test scripts. I'd rather just have plain JUnit statements which you can go and more easily edit and extend and refactor and everything. But so that's something we're still playing around with. Okay, so here's a bunch of books I can recommend if you're interested in OSGi or in Eclipse RCP. or any of the other stuff we were talking about today. And just to point out again, you're hiring, and that's the nice view you get from our office.
It's that yellow thing in the middle.
So does anyone have any more questions or? Yeah.
I really came here for Tycho. I'm struggling with it. I'm wondering if you've got like continuous integration or continuous build working with your application.
Yeah, we do. So we use Bamboo to do the continuous builds.
So how do you deal with, like in Maven, you often have your snapshots and then share that with another build. So you share the results of one build, right, with an upstream build which consumes it. And right now it looks like Nexus 4.0, and I guess as of a few days ago, Artifactory are the only ones that support P2 repositories in their repository. How do you deal with sharing of your final results, I guess, with downstream builds? What's the workflow like?
Yeah, that's a kind of a thing where we're struggling with too. So basically the way it works now is, and it seems like most people are using Tycho, they just basically they do one single big build that includes all the features and everything in the product. Right. Which is kind of silly. We just make like a small change in one plugin somewhere. You really need to go and rebuild everything. Yeah. And to a certain extent, it may be more of a problem with the build at the level of the build server. The build server would have to be smart enough to figure out, like, okay, there's a change in this one project. Which other projects does this affect?
Jenkins can do those kind of things.
So yeah, also like
P2.
So like Bamboo, they have some experimental support for dealing with Maven dependencies, but I guess it doesn't extend to like the Tycho stuff.
So a lot of types all in on Hudson, so I wouldn't expect Jenkins to necessarily support.
Well, I shouldn't say Jenkins. I use that term generically.
Okay.
So,
I'm just saying they're the main backer on Hudson, I think, besides
the big key thing for me is there's just not, aside from Jason Van Zyl has published a couple of experimental plugins for the non-pro version of Nexus that knows how to aggregate P2 metadata into a composite P2 repository, but it's all experimental and and so the big rub right now for me, at least, as I try to get this stuff off the ground in my company, is the whole workflow and how you deal with the repository, publish P2 artifacts, consume P2 artifacts, and downstream build.
Yeah, another big issue with the consumption is, so like an example I was showing here, we're directly referencing external repositories. And now, often as repositories, they don't have very clear policies of how long they keep artifacts around.
Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating because even like an Eclipse, you'd think they would have like a consistent, across different Eclipse projects, they would have like a single approach. But like
OBR is now, looks like there's standards for it to finally get a Maven-like federation of repositories. OBR, that's just like, it's been out there for a long time. I think they're just now starting to work on a real standard now that's in draft mode right now. So I don't know.
Yeah,
That's the hardest part for me. Is trying to get a real good.
Even with P2, which is kind of it is kind of a standard, and it's used within all the Eclipse projects use it, but they still, if they use it, do not have like different policies.
Yeah.
So like in one place, they will always only have like the latest version available, and if you want to get an older version, you need to go and download some zip file somewhere. And others will have like different URLs. There's a new major version that will create like a new repository location.
Discovery can be really interesting.
So kind of what we like to have is kind of a sort of a fancy local P2 repository with a convenient interface on top, where basically if you decide to use some whatever bundles, you may put in the remote repository URL once and choose what features you want. At that point, they all get transferred to a local copy, and that's where they'll live from then on. You never need to go back.
Very Maven-like, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the news that was broke, I guess, even yesterday, was that Artifactory is supporting P2 also. And again, only in the commercial version, so if you're in that stage where you're trying to introduce OSGi, trying to get some traction, and you're immediately asking for money for stuff that may not, it's challenging. So.
Yeah, so like I was looking at Sonatype, and they have some stuff you can like have a cache for a P2 repository.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work in a way that like, so then if the,
proxy.
exactly, so if they actually go and remove stuff from the original repository, it will disappear from your cache too, so that's no good.
Artifactory will actually host P2 repositories.
Yeah, so that would be more interesting. Yeah. I've also played around with, you can just use like some command line, very basic command line tools to manage P2 repositories, so you can say, okay, like from this remote repository, pull down these artifacts.
Right.
But I haven't had much joy with those either. There's all kind of errors you get if there's like, you try to add something to repository and was already added previously, it will blow up, and there's all kind of.
So there's another real sticking point, and I don't know if you ran into it. I tried to create a target platform with ECF, the Eclipse Communications Framework, add that to RCP, say it's my basic target runtime.
When
Total overlap and duplication, and the target editor does never clue that if you do one thing. So I don't know how if you run into that, because as you go and try to point at different repositories, you find the transit dependencies all overlap, and the target editor doesn't.
yeah, well, that was kind of the issue that when I tried to use the command line, you can only like in one invocation, you can only add a single feature from one repository. And then if you go like a second time and find something that has some transitive dependency that's already in your local repository, it will just blow up.
Exactly.
So
It's the same old story. Everything's modular, and software engineers and non-deployment engineers.
Exactly.
Configuration engineers.
Yeah, I think there's still a rough spots in the tool, an opportunity for startups.
And none of these repositories have ever had a documented intrusion? Nobody's ever put a Trojan up on any of these?
Well, the P2 policy in Eclipse is supposed to be, it's supposed to move towards everything signed, but that it hadn't been.
But they put the signatures in the same directory where the module is, which means they're useless. Because I can just replace the signature just as easily as I can replace the.
Well, there are probably things in place from a security perspective with Zoom, but then that depends on how well the tool is written.
It's no worse than getting Maven bundles.
Well, yeah, that's
anything off the
Maven
internet?
bundles definitely aren't handling this.
Yeah, or anything downloaded off the internet.
That's actually Sonatype's pitch. That their new product is about certifying your artifacts and creating, some way to say we could say we have the provenance of this artifact.
Okay.
I don't see it.
yeah, exactly. You can pull them in automatically, but they won't get they're not marked for
I don't
available as use until you have like verified them or decompiled them and
it's all about governance, so that enterprise types can say, here's our corporate sanctions repository, here's the stuff we've blessed from a GPL, PL, or licensing perspective, and by the way, we checked out this code and we feel comfortable that you can use it. Frankly, most people are Wild West, they pull stuff off the internet. Until something bad.
That's
another
always an
interesting
awkward conversation. So we have this jar that we've been using in the product for 6 months, and the bits in it don't line up with any publicly available version of this file.
Yeah.
How did you build it, and where did you get it from?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's been there.
yeah. Well, it's interesting with the guess maybe you can do with Maven bundles too, but like with there's this notion you can have source bundles. So you could, like, if you have the source bundles attached as well, at least you'll be able to go and look at the source code when the tool was built. So that can help a bit. Another interesting problem is how to deal with incrementing version numbers. So like in our case, meanwhile we're at like close to 100 bundles. So do we really, if we do a new major release or make changes, do we really want to go and have to review for 100 bundles? Like where do we go and increment version numbers? That doesn't sound like much fun.
Have you moved pretty consistently from require bundle to import package? That seems to be the lessons learned, I guess, from the Eclipse community is that depending on bundles is not as good as depending on packaging.
Yeah, so I didn't mention, so we talked about import package, which goes and gets specific packages. There's also a required bundle, which will kind of just pull in all the exported packages from a specific bundle. And so wherever possible, we use import package. I think there's some of the Eclipse core bundles you still need to use require bundle. There's some issues with that they have the same package is split over several bundles. Maybe you don't require, you're not going to get the one you think you want. So I think that's just a legacy issue.
Right. You seem to be saying don't use split packages because they're
Yeah, if you can avoid it.
Did you compare this to an alternative before you started? Like, and what was it, and why did you make the decision, and would you do it again?
Well, I just called around whoever would give me most money. Also, you want the kind of big decision was like, do we use kind of a web-based system, or do we go and move to the RCP system?
We looked at some other frameworks as well, but there really wasn't much in the way of application frameworks.
Yeah, there is also just, we should mention maybe NetBeans RCP, which kind of looks pretty good. Certainly like a few years back it was, and so they're also actually, I think they also seem to be moving kind of gradually towards using OSGi underneath. So, you know, anyone has experience with NetBeans RCP could be interesting, but didn't seem as widely used and mature as Eclipse RCP.
Swing application framework, that's gay.
Yeah, so the kind of the biggest discussion was really, do we build a web application, or do we go for the RCP stuff? And they're kind of the thing that was kind of the pushes toward RCP is that we have generally like things here, you know, that's simple enough. You just have tables and stuff. But then some of the tasks you may recall I showed, they have kind of more complicated. They have all kind of graphics, and you need multiple panes, and they need to have keyboard shortcuts that are customizable and this kind of stuff. So we would probably, even if we have gone with the web-based approach, we would probably certain parts of the workflow, we would still have to like maybe build a little, build not applets, but like web start stuff. And that's exactly sort of mini rich clients that will still somehow need to communicate, and that point we figure it's just simpler to just go with RCP.
So does this app run on Windows, Mac, Linux? And I mean, do you guys actually deploy it out there in the field and platform?
Yeah, so we, actually in the lab, they're all using Windows machines, but like for development we use Windows and Mac.
And formerly Linux, we used to certain parts on Linux, but one developer used to
currently,
on desktop, and it always deployed to all.
Currently we can't guarantee. But what I should say is, so I mentioned as a client and the server part. So the server part is actually, it's also an Eclipse RCP application, but Eclipse RCP can be run headlessly. And so that part actually runs on a Linux machine. So currently we can't guarantee that the UI will work nicely on that Linux. We don't test that, but in principle it should. We did find that with Mac there were some bugs we managed really surprising. Like, you know, what was the one you would drag and drop an item onto an empty table and it would lock up your entire system.
Yeah.
So I was kind of surprising, you know.
Yeah, there's still another one too. It's just on the Mac. It's kind of nasty.
I don't think Steve had a lot of love for Java.
I'm just saying there are elements of that application that you don't think could be run on a HTML.
Well, I mean, I shouldn't say you can't. You can do pretty much anything in HTML, but just there would be a lot more effort. You know, like any graphics, there's very nice graphics libraries. You can do all kind of fancy stuff. You could probably even do 3D graphics if you wanted to. It's just there's much more convenient libraries to kind of give you more high-level abstractions that we could use here. So
you can do it in one language. You have to pick SVG plus HTML plus this.
Well, that's why we're looking at RAP.
Yeah. It seems like it's getting better.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there was any kind of scheme in these Activator APIs that takes advantage of multi-core environments or guarantees, the same kind of problem that you have.
Oh, so you mean like with the Activators, like would they run in parallel?
Yeah. Do you have like
So,
do you have something similar to what Android has injected into the Java, like async statements or sync or?
Well, like I showed this jobs framework. You create jobs and they will be sent to the platform and it does the scheduling and everything and provides an UI to see what's going on.
Is that a concept? Is anybody concerned about that at all?
There is a commercial company called Paramus that does uses OSGi as a scaling system that can manage a big grid of bundles and run them in parallel. It's all built on OSGi. That's kind of off left field.
They cross over into the Genie.
Oh, you're talking about like
not anymore?
having services.
I went to the last Genie conference and they were
They're using, I think they're using remote services.
So you're talking here about probably basically having services exporting and importing services across different virtual machines or even physical machines. Yeah, I thought like in some more recent the OSGi, they had some services to allow you to do that, but that's something we haven't.
Remote declarative services.
Yeah, so
So
that
the same
looked
mechanism
into
down
that.
here, that can be remotable also, but you're kind of back into the frail distributed object world question. I did have a question about, are you using RESTful services between your client and service?
Between the client and the server? Well, so the server is kind of, it's more like a client really, that just goes and kind of figures out like, is there a task that I could do all on my own? It doesn't require human intervention. It does also have the kind of second part, which is kind of we have a generic file storage mechanism that runs on the server too. That's two separate things. Yeah, so right now it's basically really a client-server thing. Maybe at one point it would evolve into a more three-tier kind of thing. Yeah.
I asked earlier if you were using EMF. Because when we were doing our app, we would declare our model and then generate code from it, and then you could tie in your generated code. Like it would have these collections that you could then apply to your tables and all of that, and the listeners were all wired in for you and all of that. So that's context for other folks. Is there a reason you didn't go that route, or just more complexity?
Yeah, a more XML too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing is also we also using Hibernate. And, we have all the different frameworks. They're going to start standing on each other's feet. That's actually another interesting thing. So if you're using some kind of you have a relational database, but you have all those plugins, and you may have like different versions of plugins. How does that work? And so here currently we have basically the sort of the OR map objects. That's a very, very small core set, and they get very generic, and they'll have to be backward compatible for all times. And then any kind of sort of plugin specific data gets attached like as key value pairs or as JSON documents. So there's kind of a bit this mismatch. So one thing Ed is currently looking into is like maybe we shouldn't be using a relational database, but should go and use some kind of document store. So that's a whole other CJ talk.
Anytime.
Okay.
All right, folks.